I mean, like
So
we talked a little bit about like what we might talk about now, and I gave you a bunch of stuff that was kind of disorganized.
I loved it because
Any of it of interest to you that we can like? I mean, maybe you should just like pick and choose, and we can like run with it and see
I
where we
mean
end up.
totally because of my no reading the news policy, I have no way of what's going on in the world. So it is actually really helpful for
Hmm.
people to tell me. And based on what you told me, it's actually a little bit worrying, which actually does support the original point I made in that Atlantic piece about not following the news and ignorance being bliss.
Yeah.
Like, I don't feel good about this.
Yeah.
Did I really need to know that China is developing hypersonic weapons technology beyond what we're capable of? They're actually outflanking us on these military metrics. That's frightening to me. And now I know, and now I can't unknow it. I mean, is there nothing that we can do about it? We do have a podcast, and we are writers who write on foreign policy at least some of the time.
Yeah.
So I guess I should probably know that China is getting ahead of us in these respects. But, what can we really do about it? Yeah, it just makes me panic a little bit. So that's one thing I definitely want to talk about and just hear if you think there's a way forward on this and how we should maybe better think about it. Um, and then what else? The Brazil. I'm just like,
Just looking at the notes. Listen, here's a I think an interesting way to think about it. You know, I guess it's been striking to a certain extent talking to my non-foreign policy oriented colleagues at the paper. They sometimes say to me, it's just like, okay, but like war with China, it's not really going to happen, right? And I'm like, I don't know. I have no idea. Like maybe, hopefully not, right? Um, but I think that gets us to sort of a problem when you say like what can we do about it, which is like a really DC problem, right? The weird thing about DC is that we spin up a framework where we're going to war with China. And then through that framework, we interpret every news event. So China is developing hypersonic weapons. I mean, we're developing hypersonic weapons too.
but
You
they're
know,
ahead of us so
they're ahead of
far.
us. Okay. But, I mean, there's like a flip side. They know we're developing hypersonic weapons. So of course they're going to develop hypersonic weapons. And so, okay, they're ahead of us. So how do we get ahead of them? And then it does become a bit of a self-fulfilling thing. And this takes all the ideology stuff aside about like China being evil and authoritarian, must be defeated, as you say, and all the rest of it, which is fine. But you know what I mean? Like that's one of the things that I'm grappling with a lot more is when you swim in DC all the time and all like the DC bullshit world. A lot of it just becomes sort of seems self-evident, and you're like, well, obviously, this is a big problem. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we have to spend a boat ton more money to catch up. And I guess I still sort of believe that because I still am in DC world in a lot of ways. I think that the logic of these things is sort of hard to avoid. But I am struck by like the Biden administration's approach to all of this stuff, where, they're like trying to manage all of these problems, but also are really hesitant to start talking about them in terms of war, in the sense that like what you may need to reverse something like this actually is to hike defense spending by a whole bunch, and probably would require President Biden to get in front of the TV, get in front of the TV cameras and address the nation and say, my fellow Americans, it's been a good run since the end of the Cold War. We're in a different world right now. We need to act like it, take it more seriously. And, one sort of criticism of Biden is to say, well, this is really catastrophic that he's not doing that because we need to catch up to the Chinese and et cetera. But the other, I think probably the Biden folks would say is war is not inevitable. The American people aren't ready for it, don't want to go to war. It'd be politically disastrous. So why should we make that speech? And, as an analyst, you say, well, the world is getting more dangerous. We need to be doing this. The challenge is coming. But I keep getting bothered by this question in the back of my mind. It's just like, what if it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy if you let that happen? And that like Biden's sort of slow rolling this thing is more prudent policy. I just don't know. I don't know what you think about that. Like as a former foreign policy addict and on these sorts of things. I don't know.
Look, I am intrigued by this idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy and that how in some ways we run the risk of creating our own realities. That if we keep on putting ourselves on a war footing, it does make war more likely, and it does put into motion a number of other developments and consequences that escalate. That is certainly one way of looking at it. I don't want Americans to panic. I don't want to panic. I actually don't want to think so much about going to war from a personal level. And if levels of depression and politically induced fatigue and exhaustion are already plaguing our country, that we're already overwhelmed by politics and overwhelmed by a sense of catastrophe, do we really want to add the immediate prospect of war to the list of things we're asking Americans to be perpetually worried about? So I think that from a politician's standpoint, of someone who ultimately wants to not freak people out, and I think that presidents do have a responsibility to not freak people out unless they have a compelling reason to do so, then perhaps Biden's approach is more prudent. I don't think war is inevitable. And clearly colleagues and friends of yours don't think it's inevitable. But maybe that's our, we as Americans we have trouble actually imagining certain possibilities, in part because we are part of a culture that values progress. So it goes against everything we feel and know about the trajectory that history takes. Are we really getting to a point where we could have a massive war with China that is worse than anything we could have imagined, at least since World War II? I just don't think Americans are primed to think that way, to think that those things are even possible, because it goes against the arc of history. So maybe we should face facts. Maybe we should stop having this illusion of progress and the naivete that comes along with it. And maybe a speech from Biden telling us, guys, get ready for war, would push us out of our complacency. I don't know, but I don't want to deal with all this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm torn.
Arguably, the speech wouldn't have to be like, get ready to send your sons to die. It could just be, we need to take this more seriously in order to head off a catastrophe, not necessarily get ready for war, but get stronger in order to. But again, that also has its own logic, right? It has its own logic of sort of getting us there faster. It's the question of like, what's prudent stewardship, I guess, right? Is like, and that's, and we get back to the question of whether we, in the foreign policy world are in our own bubble and we sort of create our own realities, as you said. But analysis would say like all these things are pointing one way. Sure, we're part of the cycle, but the best way out of the cycle is to come out on top and deter, potential aggression against something like this.
Okay, you bring up deterrence. Now I want to bring up something related to that I think gets at maybe a more fundamental issue. And it has to do with Donald Trump. He had this fascinating interview on Fox News with Tucker Carlson, and we'll include a link to that in the show notes. And I'm not saying fascinating facetiously at all. I actually, I like broke out laughing several times He's back. I mean, I was actually surprised because I think my sense had been that Trump was losing his mojo and he just wasn't as funny. He wasn't able to connect with people the way he used to. He was becoming self-pitying and obsessed with his own legal troubles and stuff like that. So I don't know if this is changing, and if it is, I think Americans should take notice, especially Democrats, and be aware of the kind of candidate he can be, which is a compelling one.
Mm.
And I don't know if you felt the same way in watching that 10-minute clip, but I was like, damn, okay.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Well,
it's. I mean, it's at least on the the first part is about his arraignment, and it is a little bit self pitying.
but then he moved, then he shifts from it.
He shifts pretty quickly onto foreign policy, and that's, I mean, insofar as foreign policy will probably play a pretty big role in him crapping on Biden in the election.
And I was like, wait, damn,
and,
Trump knows about foreign policy?
yeah. But and then he does also, he also just plays into that thing, which is I am tough man, and it's a tough world, and as you just said, deterrence. Like,
this is the remarkable thing. So let me just lay this out for people, because it is not something I would have normally felt comfortable talking about, but because this is a long form podcast, I don't think that anything I say on this will go viral. But this is why we love podcasts and why we love Wisdom of Crowds.
Because we don't go viral.
Okay, so, and we've talked about this, you and I, Damir, in social settings, but I don't think we've really talked about it much on the podcast, which is, would Trump have invaded Ukraine if Trump had still been president? If Trump had won a second term, would Putin have done that?
Yeah.
And Trump actually brings that up in a rather explicit way, making very clear that Putin would not have invaded. But obviously he has an interest in saying that, of course. So I'm just saying that Trump is definitely making this point very explicitly.
Yep.
And I suppose his argument is that it's a version of the madman theory of international relations that I was going to say Ronald Nixon, that Richard Nixon had popularized in the late 60s and 70s, which is this idea that this guy is fucking crazy and our opponents and adversaries don't want to take a chance because you don't know for sure whether the crazy person is serious about their craziness. But then again, you can't be sure that the crazy person isn't serious about their craziness. So you got to hedge your bets and be pretty careful.
And Trump's explicit about it in his remarks, too. He says, like, that he threatened Putin and he threatened Xi, like, apparently extravagantly. Now, who knows if that's true? That's the other part. Like, that's the thing with Trump. And it's just like, how much of this has anything to do with anything? But
but it was the same thing with also George W. Bush did a version of this as well. Like, people thought George W. Bush was crazy around the time of the Iraq War. Right. And there was a sense that he could pretty much invade anywhere. Yeah. Like, who knows what this guy will do?
But I just like that Trump said that 10%. Like, that was just like, He's like,
that was hilarious.
He was just like, I don't know if they believe me all the way, but they believe me 10%.
Which actually goes very specifically to how the madman theory works. Exactly. They don't need to be, exactly.
Yeah, right.
And what he said also in regards to the Taliban, which was pretty funny, he kept on referring to this guy called Abdul. He's like, when I was talking to Abdul, I showed Abdul a picture of his house. Yeah. And then Abdul was confused, and Trump apparently said, like, you know what I'm talking about, or something like that. Oh, don't
use your imagination.
Use your imagination. So Trump was essentially threatening to blow Abdul up. But this is the broader point he was making in regards to Putin, like, and he wasn't clear about like what the consequences were, but it was like, Trump told Putin that if he tries any of that, just like crazy things are going to happen. Terrible things are going to happen.
No.
And if she invades Taiwan, again, like Trump was like, listen, we can have a great relationship, the US and China, and you guys, we're happy to let you do whatever. But if you cross this one red line, we will destroy you.
Yeah, yeah.
So
how do you feel about that? I mean, tell me how you feel about that, because this is Trump's transactionalism. He's like, Uyghurs, yeah, it's not my problem. We can have a great relationship. We trade, you great country of China. But if you do this one thing, I mean,
I'm intrigued by it. I think there's a way to combine that approach to deterrence with a prioritization of human rights and democracy. I don't think it's one or the other. So it's not as if the Biden administration is not capable of making threats. Now, the question is, if Biden makes threats, are they credible?
Right.
And that is the fundamental issue here. My sense is that no matter what Biden tells President Xi or Putin, they're going to doubt him because Biden is a reasonable person.
Yeah.
He's a good man. And he's prudent, just like Obama was.
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, when push comes to shove, these people aren't as crazy as us. They aren't just going to like start blowing shit up. So I think there's an issue here of, can the U.S. be more a credible interlocutor when it actually does draw clear red lines? And we can go back to Obama and the red line in Syria. Because Obama in 2013 did draw a clear red line.
And then proved that it was not credible. Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think there is a really fascinating set of questions here that Trump perhaps
it's partly personality. I agree, but it's also but it is how you set it up. I mean, I agree with that as well. I suppose you get like a more belligerent Wilson, like a kind of true believer, and who's also maybe it's your essay that you never wrote about John McCain, like a belligerent true believer in human rights, right? Who literally
he would be perfect for this.
Who literally threatens Armageddon over some stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, George W. Bush was also he was an actual model of this approach to some degree. He didn't take it necessarily as far.
I mean, remind me, maybe I'm forgetting. When did he rattle the saber over human rights? That's the difference.
Oh, during the Freedom Agenda.
Did he say he would go and do military shit if things? Where did he do that? That was retroactive on Iraq. That was sort of just I fucked up on Iraq. Oh, no, I did it for freedom. Exactly. That's different, right?
Exactly. But the sense of unpredictability, yes, it's true that W didn't directly tie it to human rights and democracy until a little bit later as a kind of rhetorical gambit.
Yeah.
But the fact that he did invade Iraq in the way that he did, I think made a lot of autocrats in the region fearful. And his pressure on democracy vis-a-vis Egypt and others seemed more something that they had to take a little bit more seriously, because they were like, this guy is really focused on the Middle East.
Yeah.
And he really seems to want to, quote unquote, transform it. So do we really want to test him all that much? He seems like he's a true believer, or he seemed like he was a true believer. And he seems to be very comfortable with confrontational, aggressive foreign policy. So you kind of, and I suppose neocons more generally capture these two instincts, a kind of idea around the universality of human rights and democracy, that all peoples, cultures, and religions are capable of being free and being democratic, but also a preoccupation with the U.S. military as the tip of the spear.
But 2 episodes ago, or 1 episode ago, you were against going that far. You didn't like the idea of actually militarily threatening regime change in order to to affect change.
I'm just being descriptive here. I'm just
Yeah.
describing how the neocons view it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering because you're so taken by Trump's bullying, and you're saying it would be interesting to sort of put these two together. Well, there's your neocons. So, like maybe you're working yourself up to embracing neoconservatism. Which,
look, who knows? Who knows? There could be changes in my opinions in the coming months and years. It's really hard to tell.
Sure.
I'm kind of joking, but but I have always been someone who takes this idea of, like, we are a superpower and we have to act like it. It's not enough to just be empirically a superpower. Like, people can look at the metrics and say, oh, China has no real chance of overtaking the US on all of these different economic and military metrics. Fine. But perception matters as well. And how people perceive, like, we are a superpower, but we have to act like it. And those two things are not exactly the same. There is a gap between them. And I think Americans have to find a way to close the gap, because people do push us around. I mean, even small powers and junior partners like Saudi Arabia, as we've talked about in previous episodes. When Biden visited Saudi Arabia last summer, Mohammed bin Salman gave him the diplomatic equivalent of the middle finger. He basically said, fuck you, Biden. And we went along with it and we indulged it. So we were a superpower, but we didn't act like one. And other countries, whether they're allies or adversaries, are going to find a way to exploit the gap between who we are and how we act, if that makes sense.
no, it makes sense. But, I wonder, the other bit of news in the last few weeks was that, that the Saudis effectively gave us a bit of a middle finger by,
That's all they do now.
But, they negotiated some sort of rapprochement with Iran vis-a-vis China.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is there was a headline, I think it was in Politico, said that, like, Tony Blinken, quoting, saying, like, in every meeting I have with the Saudis, I bring up LGBTQI T plus whatever, like, with them, like gay rights with them. And I mean, I guess I'm trying to think of what, if you're, and it is the thing, I think that, a lot of your interlocutors in your last book, when you were bringing this up, basically you were advocating, you don't have to, like, threaten serious things, but, like, threaten military aid, start cutting that and, like, breaking those alliances. I mean, even without threatening that, they're modulating now towards China. Now, again, probably China can't replace us, so maybe your argument still holds. But I'm saying, like, you have evidence that Blinken, in any case, was standing up for rights. Maybe not, like, the preferable order of rights. Maybe better to be focusing on democracy rather than a more niche thing of, like, minority rights for gays.
Okay. But he wasn't presenting any consequences, so it's just meaningless rhetoric. So Blinken brings up human rights in his meetings with Saudi counterparts, but there is actually no real, like, the Saudis won't do anything you tell them unless you threaten them with punitive action or you encourage them with carrots. It's got to be one or the other. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the Saudis now know that we're not actually willing to put anything on the line. We're not willing to suspend military sales. We are not willing to consider grounding their military, because if we withhold spare parts and maintenance and logistical support, we could ground Saudi jets and tanks in the matter of weeks. But the Saudis know that that's not something that we're thinking about or talking about. So they're like, okay, let Tony Blinken talk. If he wants to just go back to his constituencies and say, well, I spoke to the Saudis about human rights. And then everyone's like, ooh, rhetoric. I mean, we put too much value on rhetoric. Rhetoric is meaningless and perhaps even counterproductive if it's not backed up by military power. And that's something, Damir, that you've helped me realize over the years, that it all comes back to violence, the threat of violence. That's something that you would probably say.
Yeah.
But I do want to raise something about this Blinken thing. And we'll include a link to this Politico piece in the show notes. It's actually from last year, but I don't remember seeing this. It's like bonkers. Basically, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, he told Politico reporters that he brings up LGBTQI rights with his Saudi counterpart, quote unquote, invariably in every conversation. And I'm like, okay, wait a second. Every conversation you have with your Saudi counterpart, you literally bring up LGBTQI rights? First of all, like, I mean, I probably don't have to explain why this is just like absurd on any number of levels. First of all, I didn't know that it's now called LGBTQI. I thought it was LGBTQ plus.
Well, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know if he said the I. I don't know. I guess it's a
true.
direct
Maybe
quote.
that was just
Maybe it was just
Politico.
some headlining. But anyway,
Oh, true.
yeah.
Anyway, anyway, the point is, okay, this is a country that doesn't even have a parliament. There are like no basic rights, political rights. This is not just an authoritarian regime. It's one of the most brutal authoritarian regimes in the world. You can be arrested for a tweet that's not even explicitly critical about the regime, only if the tweet goes against regime priorities. It's just nuts. Now, so Tony Blinken is spending, I don't know, 3 minutes of a 30-minute conversation on LGBTQ rights in Saudi Arabia, where even women don't have equal rights, where women were only granted the right to drive a few years ago. This is crazy. Anyway, that was just like a little, but it's things like this that I think make it hard for other countries to take us seriously. It's a clown show. They're like, these people are not serious. They're smart and they're competent, but they're at a fundamental level, they're not serious.
So, I mean, that sort of gets at what we started this conversation on, which is this feeling one has when watching the Biden folks. And, you know, I've said it on the pod before. I haven't written it yet, or maybe I have, I don't remember. That actually on Ukraine in the run-up, I do think Biden handled it better, and maybe the policies I would have preferred in the run-up to the war wouldn't have ended up playing as well. So, I mean, I think credit where credit's due on certain stuff. But like the bigger picture, it seems to be sort of emerging. And maybe it's unfair because, like you said, you know, I'm following the news and you're not. And so maybe I'm just like caught in a trough of news right now, and it seems grimmer. But there's a sense, you know, there's this parallel between, you know, bullying, balls out Trump versus Biden, you know, like quietly managing. There's this question of priorities and sort of like box checking and rhetoric versus actually a plan for anything. But you just get a sense that the Biden folks, they're just really pushing to get through the next cycle more than anything else. That and maybe that's fair. Maybe they've you know, calculated that the country can't bear it, and they can't, like, the country can't bear stronger leadership. So they're just trying to, you know, do as best they can with, you know, the one hand tied behind their back. But maybe it's also tied to this because this is, you know, in many ways like the third Obama administration, that what you also alluded to earlier, that sort of progressive optimism about the world, which is, you know, you don't have to do too much, like avoid getting into catastrophic wars, etc. The arc of history is bending our way, you know, sort of maybe a faith that China will implode, and it might, you know, that it won't come to war, and it might not, that, you know, they played Ukraine right. The Russians are exhausted at this point. It's not clear whether the Ukrainian counteroffensive is going to lead to a breakthrough, but even if it doesn't, even if it's a stalemate, Russia's pretty much ruined, and, you know, America didn't have to go to war, so great success. You know, I mean, I have a lot to quibble with that characterization of Ukraine, and maybe even on the characterization of China, but it's defensible on the merits. But I guess what I'm getting at is, like, as someone who's like watching events closely and maybe a little concerned about where things are, it does feel like maybe the world's getting away from them a little bit.
Mm, mm.
That preoccupation of making it to the next cycle, that preoccupation of, steady hand on the tiller because America can't take the upset of a really bold policy one way or the other. That timidity maybe is getting them to a place where they've misjudged a lot, and maybe catastrophes coming. I mean, I guess history will be the judge. There's no way to really tell that, but I guess that's where I'm at. That's what's sort of gnawing at me at this point.
And I largely, and that's my sense as well. And even well before this recent spate of not very positive news, I always had this sense that there was just something about the Biden team that just didn't seem up to the occasion. That you felt maybe more secure than you would have under a Trump administration, for sure, because let's say even hypothetically that Putin didn't invade Ukraine if Trump was president, still there was always a sense in the Trump years that like things can all, you don't feel like there's any steady hand, that there aren't people in government who are just like vaguely competent. And there is a sense of security with the Biden folks that they are sufficiently smart and competent that the world will not end immediately, right? But that's a very low bar. And where they might have the intelligence and the competence, they seem to have a lack of a certain je ne sais quoi. And I was going to describe what that je ne sais quoi is, but that's precisely what the French phrase means. It means I don't know what.
Right. Well, I mean, maybe that that je ne sais quoi is again just to push on that thing. It's the toxic belief that the world is getting better. That and you see it again, and I'll press you on this because this is something that we've gone back and forth on before. Is this framing of autocracy versus democracy? I mean, I think that's one of the things that I think Walter Mead wrote about it 2 weeks ago, and it is sort of like a set of worldview blinders for them, which is Trump is the face of autocracy, as is Putin and Xi and the rest of it. So there's almost like a global transnational struggle of Democrats versus authoritarians. And so you get this kind of like bleeding over of that conviction, which ties to that progressive conviction you said about before, right? This idea that the Obama idea, the arc of history bends. And that leads to a kind of, I don't know. Again, it's a kind of complacency. I mean, I guess one could also like look at a different way and come up with a different conclusion. But it's that sort of thing that leads to a kind of both complacency and self-satisfaction and timidity at the same time.
Well said. Yes.
And it still comes back to me that I at the end of the day, I just don't think that the autocracy versus democracy thing really holds that much water as a framework. I mean, I understand where you come at it from, and maybe like a militant democratic agenda could make something like that work.
Maybe I should write a book about that.
Yeah, maybe. Think about that. No, but you know what I mean? Like it's I'm struck that like on the merits, that framework's actually not working right now. Like analytically, you mentioned Lula because it's something I mentioned to you before we started recording, but he's in China right now and basically doing the whole BRICS, we must stand up against the West and, the former colonial powers and the rest of that, the global South phenomenon. We can argue about how significant that is, but certainly one thing we can't argue about is that Brazil's great democratic success in throwing off the authoritarian dictator Bolsonaro and replacing him with the true Democrat Lula, who was embraced at the Summit for Democracy and all the rest of that. Off he goes to China. to play his little games
You
and
know what else
do
he said, which
geopolitics.
is crazy, just to add so listeners understand what we're talking about here. I was thrilled that Lula won. So that was, but
But
well, also like it was unfair what happened to him. I mean, he was put in
sure,
jail on trumped up charges,
yeah,
and that allowed Bolsonaro to become the president of Brazil because Lula was no longer in competition because of his legal situation and then being in prison. So there were real consequences for Brazil in that regard. And Lula was also always, I think, an exemplar of a new kind of socialist democrat that you could still be firmly on the left in a Latin American context, but that democracy could accommodate that without having excessive polarization or even civil conflict. Because throughout much of the Cold War, whenever there was a threat or a possibility of a left-wing politician winning elections, things sort of fell apart. So it was positive in that respect. But then I see Lula saying kind of crazy things. Well, they're not crazy. I suppose they're the sorts of things that a leftist anti-imperialist would say. So maybe I shouldn't be surprised or disappointed. But at a January news conference with the German chancellor, Lula said, apparently he was suggesting that Ukraine bears at least some responsibility
yeah,
for the war.
yeah.
And the quote was, if one, oh, yeah, okay, yeah. The
Can
quote
you
is,
read it?
if one doesn't want to, two can't fight, which is a little bit confusing. I think that might be a bad translation. But what he's saying is that it takes two to fight, basically.
Yeah,
And so Ukraine has a choice.
yeah,
And they're partly fueling this war,
yep,
which is obviously off-putting to many of us.
right. No, but whatever, we can analyze where this comes from, et cetera, et cetera. I'm more interested in pushing that question about again, it's partly democratic peace theory, it's partly this American sense of progress, it's partly this Biden frame of authoritarianism versus democracies. I think again, I've always sort of felt it in my gut that countries are going to not really abide by those supposedly core values to have them stick together. That like democratically elected leaders, and especially ideological ones. And again, I don't mean ideological as a slur. I just think that there's a lot of grievance and like a well-developed ideological framework for a lot of leaders in the global South to channel that resentment, that resentment over colonialism, over post-colonial treatment, over their status in the world. Just there's a lot of resentment there. So again, it's far from incongruous to me to see what Lula's doing. I'm not surprised. The articles are like, oh, great disappointment among people who really were banking on like democratic renewal. I'm like, come on, guys, like, come on. Like none of this is surprising. And we talked last week about Modi and democracy there, and that's a different case because of populists, really bringing into question what qualifies as a democracy, and that's what the discussion was about. But I think in Brazil's case, insofar as I know, that's not the question here. This is something else at play. And there goes the authoritarianism versus democracy. Now, again, you could still, I think, make a case that in the medium to long term, Brazil will come to its senses when they figure out what China is exactly.
Precisely.
Maybe. But again, if the Chinese are smart and, they don't really have any real direct beef with Brazil, I think they can buy them off. They're a huge market. Brazil has a lot to give. There's lots of opportunities for this, and again, there's underlying that is this assumption that like people in democratic societies care about democracy worldwide, and I'm just not sure that's the case. I've never been convinced of it. So I mean, I always sort of assert that, but I feel like here I have like a pretty cut and dry counterexample to put before you. So I don't know, just curious.
Wait, are you saying that Brazilians, so i.e. people who live in a democracy, don't care about democracy elsewhere? Or am I
That's more or less what I'm saying. I'm saying that basically one of the tenets of democratic peace theory is that the value of basically all the values attendant to democracy will lead democratic societies to clump together for reasons, because if an elected leader were to come and start supporting a non-democratic society, he would probably presumably pay some sort of penalty. I'm going to guess that Lula's going to pay no penalty on this. Maybe I'm wrong, but you know.
Yeah, I have thoughts on this. Okay, Damir, there's a sound that I have to turn. I heard it was a clicking sound. Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
Okay, lesson learned. Just stick to one place to record from in the future.
Yeah.
Which will be easier when I don't have this office.
Tell me, what are your thoughts on Lula and democracy, authoritarianism, etc.?
So, well, first of all, Brazil and Latin American countries have a very particular context when it comes to these long-standing grievances against the U.S. because of developments in the Cold War, as I alluded to earlier. So it's understandable, and in some ways it's comparable to what we might expect in the Middle East if there were democratically elected Islamist parties. As I've often said, they are going to be anti-American in certain ways that we won't be thrilled about, and that we have to absorb those costs. But we absorb them in the knowledge that there has to be a greater, broader, longer-term strategy where we stay the course and we try to build better relationships with small d Democrats wherever we might find them, whether they're socialists in Latin America or Islamists in the Middle East, because at the end of the day, these are parties that benefit from democratization. They benefit from not turning back to an authoritarian past, and the U.S. can play an important role in that, in buttressing these young democracies and strengthening them going forward. But we have to make an effort not to alienate leftists in Latin America just because they seem like they occasionally play footsie with China and Russia. So we can't punish Brazil. Like, that's not the solution to this.
Okay,
punishing countries that don't align with our national security interests. But I am relatively confident that in the longer run, democracies will realize that they share something with us at a fundamental level, which does have major implications.
Here's just like a, before you get to another point, because I think this is interesting, right? I wasn't suggesting anyone punish Brazil for this. I was just sort of poking holes in the authoritarianism versus democracy framework. But I think if you asked Lula about American democracy, he would say a democracy has repeatedly fucked us. The history of Latin America is the American democracy fucking us.
So we have to show him that we're going to stop fucking him.
Okay, but
that requires a longer-term vision. We
weren't just fucking him because of the Cold War and communism, though. I mean, that's a big part of it. But I think, Lula's, and I think a lot of leftist sort of well-developed ideologies has to do with capitalism on this. And I think of twinning of a certain kind of capitalism and democracy, right? That it's a certain kind of Anglo-capitalist democracy, which tends to imperialism. So the framework for him is not authoritarianism versus democracy. The framework for him is, a free, independent set of countries like Brazil, and a bunch of imperialist scum. I'm fairly sure if you really were to, well, I don't know, actually, Lula, I don't know what his opinions are on the CCP and actually the communist government. I don't know how far his leftist sympathies go if he's in that mold all the way. But, a softer version of it would be China's a piece of shit country too, but certainly the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In that sort of sense, and the bigger enemy is the near imperialist. That's a far imperialist, and we can trade with them. It's fine. That's a very coherent worldview that has nothing to do with democracy and authoritarianism. And that is legitimated through a democratic outcome, which presumably wasn't a worldview that was smuggled into this election, but is actually shared by a lot of voters that were like, yeah, that's right.
Yes.
So again, it just, my question is one of like, how foundational is that democracy versus autocracy thing? I guess that's always been my question about this and my pushback against it.
Yeah, look,
because if that's the framework for everything, it's just like, I think it's suffocating and you miss stuff.
It's a very fair point. Anytime when you have a generalized framework that you try to apply to a large number of cases, not everything's going to fit. And that's the difference between a framework and a blueprint. So I think the framework is a good way for us as Americans to understand our role in the world. It's a good way to understand that the stakes with China and Russia, and China in particular as a country that wants to see more authoritarian countries just like it. Maybe not, they're not trying to export a Chinese model or some kind of Confucian thing, but all other things being equal, China prefers systems that look more like its own, a natural thing. So I think that, and there will be cases where this framework doesn't fit, especially in the global South, because of a particular history, which is specific to the colonial and post-colonial experience. But I don't think that invalidates the broader insights that come from the framework about about the inherent strengths of democracies as a regime type and the inherent weaknesses of authoritarian regimes as a regime type. Like, so my argument comes back to something quite basic, that authoritarian regimes are inherently unstable in the medium to longer term. They are risky propositions. They're unlikely to stand the test of time. They're able to cover profound weaknesses through authoritarian manipulation. And I think there's been a lot of coverage and more recent academic work on how, and historical work on how the Chinese economic miracle was not actually an economic miracle. That I think that Decatur's book, I think, makes one version of this argument. Frank Decatur.
Don't know it, but yeah, we'll put it in the show notes.
Okay, let me just make sure I'm oh, good. Yeah, I didn't get his last. It's probably some Dutch. It's almost certainly a Dutch last name.
A Dutchman. Oh, okay. we'll put it in the show notes as that Dutch book Shadi's talking about.
But he has his book called China After Mao, The Rise of a Superpower, where he does try to challenge some of the conventional wisdom about how we view China, and the fact that we bought into this discourse around the rise of China.
Yeah.
So much so that Americans can't even get beyond it. We still think of China as a rising power, even though one might argue that it's been declining in certain specific ways in recent years. But anyway, I think that if China is going to continue showing its weaknesses, then will a country like Brazil really want to hitch its fortunes to China in the longer term?
Yeah.
And I think if we believe if we believe that we have something to offer, that we have a competitive advantage compared to China, in part because of regime type, then let's own that. Let's act like it. And let's, we're not going to be able to make things up to Lula overnight because his grievances are long-standing. But we could also, I think, do well to pay a little bit more attention to Latin America.
Yeah.
Like, we don't have a Latin American strategy. No one even cares about Latin America. When was the last time you heard someone talk about the Biden administration's policy towards Latin America?
Right.
Which gets to your bigger concern. The Biden administration doesn't have, it wants to manage. It wants to prevent things from becoming worse. It wants to get to the next election cycle or to the next year or whatever the short-term period is. And there is a timidity that comes from doing foreign policy in that way.